Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little for mypokercoaching.com, and today we are going to be discussing pot odds and how to use them to your advantage. At the end of this video, you're going to know everything you need to know about pot odds so you can get in there, utilize them well, and crush your opponents. The pot odds tell you the price you are being offered to continue in a pot. Whenever you're facing a bet, you have to figure out, how often do I need to win in order to continue? So you're going to want to compare the odds of making your hand, or winning the hand in general, to the odds that you are being offered. And if you like the price, the odds you're being offered, you should continue in the pot. And if you do not like the odds you're being offered, you should fold. Let's first discuss how to calculate pot odds. This is something a lot of people do horribly wrong, and it costs them a lot of money throughout their entire poker career. An important thing to know is that when you call a bet and you win the pot, you get your bet back. And that's going to impact the equation you use to figure out your actual pot odds. So as you can see here, your pot odds equal the bet you are facing divided by the current pot plus the bet you're facing plus the bet you're facing, which is essentially the bet you are matching, right? It's how much more you have to put in. So it's the pot plus the amount your opponent put in plus the amount you're putting in. So, for example, say your opponent bets $50 into a $100 pot. What are your odds? How often do you need to win? A lot of people mistakenly think 50 divided by 100 is 50%. You need to win half the time. Absolutely not. Other people think you need to win $50 or 50 divided by 100 plus your opponent's bet, which is 50, 150 total, which would be 33%. Absolutely not. That is not the equation. Do not do it wrong. In this scenario, it's 50 divided by the pot, which is 50, plus your opponent's bet, plus your opponent's bet again. So 50 divided by 200 is 0.25. You move the decimal spot 2 to the right. That makes a decimal into a percentage. And that means you need to win 25% of the time. So in this spot, if you will win more often than 25% of the time, you should continue in the pot. Here are some common pot odds. I would definitely recommend you, to some extent, commit these to memory, or at least commit to memory the concepts that come from these very common pot odds. If you're facing a tiny bet of 10% pot, which is actually what a lot of the best players use in situations where they are heavily favored, you only need to win 8.3% of the time. And the thing is, most hands in most scenarios, unless they're really, really bad, are going to win like 12% of the time against most reasonable ranges. So if you're folding to a tiny bet with pretty much anything, your opponent's going to be pushing you around and winning little bits of equity from you over and over. This is what a lot of the best players in the world do on a regular basis. If you're facing a normal small bet of, let's say, 25% pot, you only need to win 16.7% of the time, which is not all that often. If you're facing a pot size bet, now you have pot divided by the pot plus the pot size bet plus the pot size bet, which is 33%. If you're going to win 33% of the time or more, you need to be sticking around in these scenarios. If you're facing a giant bet of 2 times the size of the pot, you're going to find most people fold to 2 times the size of the pot bets with almost everything, by the way. But the equation here is 2 divided by 1 plus 2 plus 2, which equals 40%. So if you're going to win 40% of the time or more facing a 2 times pot size bet, you should continue. Now, I will say, a lot of people, when they bet 2 times the size of the pot, they have a really strong hand. So if they have a really strong hand, you should probably be folding a lot. But if your opponent will bluff adequately, then it's a spot where you actually do have to stick around some portion of the time. So now that we know the common pot odds, we need to figure out how often a draw will complete when you happen to have one. So let's go through the common draws you're likely to have and discuss how often they will win. One of the more common draws that is not so good is a gut shot straight draw. This is when you have 4 outs. Let's say the flop comes Queen Jack 3, and you have 9-8. In this scenario, you need to get a 10 to make a straight. There are 4 10s on the deck, so you have 4 outs to improve to a straight. What about when you have 2 overcards? Say the flop is 8-7-2, and you have King Queen. In this spot, King High may or may not be good, but if you get a King or a Queen, it probably is. There are 6 outs. You have 3 Kings and 3 Queens remaining in the deck. You don't have 4 because one of each of them is in your hand. If you have an open-ended straight draw, say the board is 8-7-3, and you have 6-5. In this spot, you need to get a 9 or a 4. You have 8 outs to improve to a straight. If you have a flush draw, this is when you have, let's say, 2 spades in your hand and there are 2 spades on the board. In this spot, there are 13 spades total in the deck, minus the 4 that you see, 2 in your hand and 2 on the board, which give you 9 outs total. If you have a flush draw with a gut shot straight draw, you have 12 outs. You may say 4 plus 9 equals 13. But you have to realize that one of the outs that gives you a straight also gives you a flush. So you have to make sure you don't double count that. And similarly, a straight flush draw has 15 outs. So once you know how many outs you have, you can now figure out how often your draw will complete with 1 card to come or with 2 cards to come. Say you're facing an all-in bet on the flop. There's no more betting to be made, and you know if you call the flop all in, you're going to get to see the turn and the river. What you do in this scenario is you would multiply the number of outs you have by 4. That's how often you will win with 2 outs or 2 cards to come. If you're only going to see 1 card, though, perhaps because, you know, your opponent's always going to go all in on the turn if you call their flop bet, now you take the number of outs you have and multiply it by 2. So let's give you an example. Let's say you are facing a bet on the flop. You know your opponent's always going to shove the turn because that's just how they operate, which may or may not be the case in reality. You take the number of outs you have and multiply it by 2. So let's say you have a flush draw. You have 9 outs times 2. 9 times 2 is 18. That means you are going to win roughly 18% of the time, assuming you only get to see 1 card. Now, in this scenario, you got to realize, again, that you are going to get to see the turn card some portion of the time when or the river card when your opponent's not all in. So this is kind of rough math. And realize that your odds actually are going to depend on your opponent's range a little bit. So this is rough math. I just want to make that clear. But you take the number of outs you have, multiply it by 2, and that is the percentage of the time you will improve to whatever your drawing hand is on the next card. Let's say, again, you're facing the all-in bet on the flop. And you know if you call, you get to see the turn and the river. Now you take the number of outs you have, multiply it by 4, and that is how often you will improve to the hand you are drawing to with 2 cards to come. So let's say you have a gut shot straight draw. 4 times 4 is 16. That means you're going to make your straight 16% of the time. So if your opponent goes all in for a tiny 10% pot bet on the flop, which won't happen all that often, but maybe it will, you need to be calling with your gut shot straight draw because you're going to win 16% of the time, and you only need to win 8.3% of the time, right? If you have a straight flush draw, and you get to see the turn and the river, 15 times 4 is 60. You're going to improve to a straight or a flush 60% of the time. Going back to the pot odds, you can't even fold to a gigantic bet. Kind of cool, right? So make sure you understand this, and if you're going to win more often than the pot odds dictate you should win, you should almost always be sticking around. Now let's discuss implied odds. When you call a bet, assuming stacks are not all in, you may be able to win more on the next betting round. And the extra chips or dollars you can win are your implied odds. Let me give you an example. Suppose $500 deep at 2-5 no limit hold'em in a cash game. The button raises to $15 and you call from the big blind with 7-6 of spades. Flop comes 8-5-2, no spades. You check and your opponent bets $30. The pot's 32 in this spot. They're 15 plus your 15 plus the small blind. So your pot odds are 30 divided by the 32 pot plus their 30 plus your 30, which is about 33%. Okay. How often are you going to get there on the turn? Well, you have 8 outs times 2, which is 16%. So you're going to make your straight on the turn 16% of the time. 16% is way less than 33, so you may think I should fold. But no. Let's consider our implied odds. Our exact implied odds are going to be difficult to determine because you have to make a bunch of estimations, but let me go through the logic that a lot of players use in this spot. In this spot, let's say you think your opponent will bet $75 on the river or on the turn almost every time. Because you know if they bet the flop on the 8-5-2 board, if the turn is a 9 or a 4, they're just going to keep betting very frequently. Maybe that happens in reality, maybe it doesn't. Maybe they only bet half the time or a third of the time, whatever. This is where you have to figure it out. Let's say they're going to bet $65 most of the time, though. And let's say if they bet the turn, you think they're going to bet the river for $200 roughly 30% of the time. This means that you will get $65 in on the turn, on average, because maybe you take 75 times 0.85 or something like that, and it'll give you about 65%, because maybe or $65 because you think they're going to bet 85% of the time or something like that. And then you can get $60 on the river, which is $200 times 30. Something like that. Again, kind of rough math, but this gives you roughly $125 in implied odds. And that amount should be added to the amount you can potentially win. Realize you're not presuming you're going to stack your opponent for $500 every time. It doesn't work like that because you're not going to stack them every time, but you will get some money in, right? So let's take a look at this. 30 divided by 32 plus 30 plus 30 plus 125 equals 14%. So now, accounting for the implied odds, you need to win 14% of the time, but you will win 16% of the time, or at least you'll make a straight on the turn 16% of the time. So you should continue. And as a general rule, assuming the stacks are kind of deep, you should not be folding very many draws, like flush draws, straight draws, gut shots with overcards, etc., when you are facing a pot size bet or less on the flop. This is something a lot of people do wrong. They think I'm not getting the right immediate odds, so I have to fold. But no. You got to stick around. Let's discuss some complications with implied odds, because it's not actually that simple. Let's take a look at the 7-6 of spades again versus a bet on the 8-5-2 board. Realize that if you call your opponent's bet, the turn may check through. Okay, you get to see the turn or the river for free. But if you have 7 high on the river, out of position, you probably don't want to just check and lose the pot. You should probably bluff. And maybe if you bluff a lot in this pot, you'll win the pot a ton, because if your opponent doesn't bet the turn, maybe they always have garbage. Great. You win the pot a lot. That's very good for you. Alternatively, when your opponent checks back the turn, maybe they have a lot of ace high and they're just never folding ace high to a river bet, and you lose very often when you bluff the river. That's not great, right? So we don't really know what's going to happen in that scenario. Maybe you hit a 7 or a 6 and make a pair. If you make a pair and your opponent keeps betting the turn, obviously you're not folding, and you may win or lose from that point. Or maybe it goes check, check. You make a middle pair and you win or lose, right? And it's kind of difficult to know what your equity is in those scenarios. Also, say you do make your straight and you check raise on the river. You check call the flop, you check call the turn when you make the straight, you check the river, your opponent bets. Maybe every time they bet that $200 bet on the river, which is only going to happen 30% of the time, but maybe every time they bet that $200 bet, they're just going to call off if you shove for another $450 or whatever it is. And if that's the case, well, now if you go back to this equation, this number is not actually 200 30% of the time. It would be 450 30% of the time, which would be what, $150? So this number here would be 150, which would make this number down here 210, which means now on the flop you need to win not very often at all, right? Which will make your flop call amazingly profitable. So realize that implied odds are very often difficult to calculate precisely, but you need to be considering them. And don't just presume you're never going to get any more money in, and also don't presume you're going to always get all the money in, because it doesn't work like that. You're going to get some money in. Now let's discuss reverse implied odds. Realize that you may improve to a strong hand, but still lose. And hands that have that property, that happens a lot to them, these have reverse implied odds. Hands before the flop that have huge reverse implied odds are big card with a little card, like ace-8 offsuit or king-9 offsuit, because these hands often make top pair marginal kicker. And the problem with top pair marginal kicker is that they usually win a small pot or lose a big pot. Imagine someone raises, you call with ace-8 on the button, and the flop comes ace-9-3. If your opponent bets the flop and the turn and the river, top pair marginal kicker's not looking so hot, right? And for that reason, these hands have big reverse implied odds, and very often they should be folded before the flop. If you study pre-flop game theory optimal ranges, you'll see hands like ace-8 are just folding to initial raises, and king-9 are folding to initial raises because they don't want to get involved. If you see the flop and you flop the low end of a straight, especially a gut shot to the low end of the straight, you have to be very, very careful. Say someone raises, you call a 9-8 suited, and the flop comes jack-10-3. Okay, you have the bad end of a straight draw. If your opponent bets, you obviously can't fold if they make a small bet, but realize if a queen comes on the turn, giving you queen, jack, 10, 9, 8, you could easily be against ace, king, or king, 9, which most people play in a lot of scenarios if they're the initial raiser. So you may end up losing a big pot when you make that straight, and so you have to be very careful with the low end of straights. The same thing goes for weak flush draws, because if you make a 5 high flush and your opponent's trying to load in their money, well, they could very easily have a good hand. And this is especially true in multi-way pots. A very common thing that happens is you run flush into flush multi-way, because if someone raises and a bunch of people call, you're going to call with, let's say, the 5-4 spades on the button, and say the flop comes 9-8-3 with 2 spades. If someone bets and someone calls and someone calls and someone calls, you should probably ditch your flush draw immediately, because it's highly likely someone has a flush draw that is better than 5 high, right? And if you do make a flush, and they all checked you on the turn because they're just not going to load their money in because they realize somebody could have a flush, you very often won't have very good implied odds because your opponents are all going to get out of the way. So you should probably just fold the bad flush draws immediately, especially if it goes bet and a raise. definitely get out of the way because the bet's probably pretty strong multi-way, and the raise is very strong multi-way, and you could easily be against a better flush draw and a good strong made hand, and you're going to be drawing thin or dead. So make sure you do not get in trouble with these reverse implied odds hands, especially if you are playing multi-way. Let's go through a few more pot odds examples. We're going to be discussing when you are facing an all-in before the flop, because this is a relatively simple spot because you're only accounting for the immediate betting round because there is no more money to bet. Realize that your hand will win some amount of the time against all hands your opponent would go all in with. Let me give you an example. Suppose 10 big blinds deep, the hijack goes all in, the cutoff folds, the button folds, the small blind folds, and it is on you in the big blind. Okay? Let's say you think the hijack is going to go all in with this range. This is roughly the game theory optimal range. They're shoving the hands in red, folding the hands in white. All right, that's what they're going all in with. What are our pot odds? Okay, in this scenario, you have to consider, because we're in the big blind, how much more are we calling? Well, we already have 1 in the pot, but that 1 in the pot's not ours anymore. So we're actually calling only 9 more. So we have to put in 9 more big blinds to win. The 9 more we're putting in, plus the opponent's 10, plus the previous pot, which was the small blind, the big blind, and the ante, assuming that's 1 big blind ante. Do the math, it gives us 41.8% of the time. So you can profitably call if you will win more than 41.8% of the time. So which hands have more than that equity against that range? Well, you can use a hand range calculator like Equilab or many other ones out there to see which hands have more than 41.8% against the hijack's all-in range. You can go through every single individual hand and figure that out. A lot of the tools like Equilab have a hand range calculator feature where you can put in your opponent's range and ask it which hands have more than 41.8% equity, and it will spit out this range. All the hands here have more than 41.8% equity, which means you can call profitably with all of these hands. Now, the hands on the cusp of playability, like these down here, this right here, these will barely win more than 41.8% of the time, and for that reason, you have to be a little bit more cautious with those. Let's say you're playing in a tournament where there's actually merit in not going broke. Let's say, because we are down to 10 big blinds, there are 50 people remaining in the tournament and 25 get in the money. This is a spot where you can't play super tight and think, all right, I'm going to be able to get in the money every time if I just fold a lot, but you still don't want to take risks that are close, right? So you perhaps want to have 44% equity instead of 41.8. I think this is reasonable, and this is often what you will want in a scenario like that. And now you would call off with a range like this, with these hands in red. All of these hands in this range have more than 44% equity against the opponent's all-in range. Okay? So in this scenario, you should call with these hands. Now you may ask, how am I supposed to know all this when I'm actually playing? How am I supposed to figure that out? The answer is you have to study a lot away from the table. You have to figure out which hands have X% equity, in this scenario 44%, against the opponent's all-in range. You can study a lot of game theory optimal charts, or you can run a lot of equations, either one, but you do need to do the work away from the table and see how often specific hands will win in these scenarios. Also, I want to make it very clear, whenever you're running this spot, you don't necessarily which range has more than 44% equity against the opponent's range. You want to figure out which specific hands have more than 44% equity against the opponent's range. Because, for example, Pocket Aces has way more than 44%. And if you run a whole range, you're going to find that an entire range will be much wider that has more than 44%, but that's not how it works because we actually know our individual hand in this scenario. I'll give you a few more tips for all-in pre-flop scenarios. Realize that your opponent's range may not necessarily be linear. In this spot, we had the opponent just shoving everything, right? What if instead the opponent min raises the best hands? Say they min raise aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, and they shove everything else. Well, now their range is missing the best hands, which will allow you to call wider, right? So realize your opponent's range may or may not be linear. Also, you have to account for players yet to act. Say the button goes all in and you're in the small blind. The big blind is going to wake up with a really good hand about 5% of the time and never, ever, ever fold, right? So you have to account for that. That's going to force you to call off a little bit tighter. Say the player first to act goes all in and you're in second position. This is a situation where some people call off with hands like pocket eights and ace jack offsuit every time for 10 big blinds. But it's an easy fold because you have to worry about the 7 other players behind you waking up with the nuts. And that's obviously going to happen roughly 5% of the time each. And that is a real number that will absolutely crush your equity. So when there are a lot of players yet to act, you have to call off a whole lot tighter. Also, presume your assumptions may be off a little bit. Perhaps the opponent actually shoves a little bit tighter than this. Say they don't shove these suited connected type hands, and maybe they don't shove the weaker ace-x hands. If that's the case, your calling range will now have to be tighter because your opponent's range is stronger, right? So realize that your assumptions about your opponents may be a little bit off, and definitely make a point to account for the payout implications. If you're on the bubble of a tournament, the next person out gets nothing, everybody else gets in the money. Now you need to account for that and call off way tighter, because if you just fold for some number of hands, then you will get in the money and collect a payout jump for close to free. So that's it for pot odds. I hope you learned a lot today. If you did, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. If you have any other questions about pot odds, feel free to let us know down there in the comments. If you enjoy the videos here, make sure you click the notification bell. We have a lot of great videos coming out on this channel, and I want to be sure you do not miss any of them. Good luck in your games, have fun, and may the pot odds forever be in your favor.